Ladies and gentlemen, good evening. I'm demonstrating, I hope, that the loudspeaker system works at the back. Can you hear me, Steve? Right, well, this is the first major improvement on using the MacDonald Gallery of the Gherkin Museum. We have a loudspeaker system which I hope works, and because it's strapped around my ears, it follows me round and I hope won't fade. Anyway, we are now christening the lecture facility that we have here. First time we've used it. I won't say that it's yet working perfectly, but it's working adequately for this evening. I fear that the loop system, which is supposed to be in place, isn't yet in place. But those of you who are coming back for my second talk will find that it will be working by then. We've just switched the temperature control on, so we're now air conditioning, and it remains to be seen whether actually fairly shortly we'll all be shivering. I don't know, but it's switched on. So these are all new improvements that we've been able to put into place. The exhibition with the Rifles to Waterloo opened successfully on Wednesday with the Duke of Wellington doing a very good job, not least on BBC South Television. The exhibition is about 95% as we would want it. There are still one or two things to be done. It's called snagging in the trade, and a bit of snagging to attend to. But very soon we shall have it exactly as we want it. So, a bit of a marathon coming up this evening, and I'm not sure how you'll manage it. But it's been done for a purpose. I don't pretend to be an expert on Waterloo. I do have a fairly reasonable knowledge of the battle, not least because I helped the storyteller and interpretation consultant produce all the graphics that you see in the exhibition. And you can't write the graphics unless you've got a pretty good idea of what actually happened. So, but I'm not an expert, and I don't want to set about giving you a blow-by-blow account of Waterloo. What I'm trying to do tonight, and we'll be doing next week with another audience, is giving an overview of what the preliminaries, if you like, before the battle, so that you can put the Battle of Waterloo into its broader context. But as I say, it's not going to be a blow-by-blow. And I hope that it won't be too much of an endurance test. But Waterloo, for my money, is an extremely interesting campaign. But what makes it more interesting than anything else is that it's actually not too difficult a campaign to cover, because it has very conveniently a beginning, a middle, and an end. And it doesn't stretch over too long a time. Choosing your start point is probably the most difficult aspect of it. And some of you may be surprised that I've chosen as my start point not what you might have expected, which is Napoleon's escape from Elba, the start of what you will all know as the 100 Days, but actually Napoleon's exile to Elba, which historically takes us back to April 1814. And this is a rather splendid cartoon by George Cruikshank, which interestingly enough was published on the 14th of April, only 3 days after Napoleon had been exiled to Elba under the terms of the Treaty of Fontainebleau. George Cruikshank, I think, is probably one of the best cartoonists of the time, and you'll find a number of his cartoons in the British Museum. In fact, the British Museum did until recently, and may still have on, an exhibition of these cartoons. Anyway, what I like about the cartoon is it's showing the disgraced Napoleon being led away in the fashion that a disgraced soldier would be drummed out of his regiment. And you can see that, amongst other things, you may not be able to see, but those of you who can, will be able to spot that he's wearing his coat back to front, that he has a halter around his neck, and that his hands are tied behind his back. So, a nice cartoon. Under the terms of the Treaty of Fontainebleau, some of you may not know that Napoleon was promised a sizable pension, which actually he never received. He was granted sovereignty over Elba, and he was allowed to retain his title Emperor, and he was permitted to take with him a militia force, a small army of just over 1,000 men, of whom battalions were members of his old imperial guard. Now, this is another of George Cruikshank's cartoons. This one shows Napoleon, little bony gone to pot, it's called, and it shows him sitting on a chamber pot, appropriately, contemplating suicide. Now, while it is true that Napoleon did attempt suicide on the 12th of April, the day after he was exiled to Elba, and didn't make a very good job of it, the suicide pill, the poison that he was using, it was past its sell-by date. The cartoon, in other respects, is not actually a very accurate reflection of what Napoleon achieved whilst he was on Elba. While he was there, he created a small navy to supplement his army. He also developed the iron mines on the island. He drained the marshes, and he issued numerous decrees, including a number extolling modern agricultural methods. But he was also harbouring grand designs. He maintained pretty close links with a number of, you might call, his friends on the mainland of France, and he soon learned that the Bourbon monarchy, Louis XVIII, who had been put on the throne, that the Bourbon monarchy, the restored Bourbon monarchy, was not behaving much better than the old monarchy of Louis XVI. In fact, it very quickly lost all credit as far as the population of France, or the majority of the population of France, were concerned. And by February 1815, Napoleon had judged that the moment was right to make a triumphal return to France. And his opportunity came when Colonel Sir Neil Campbell, who had accompanied him to Elba when he was went into exile and was responsible for keeping an eye on him. When Colonel Campbell went to the mainland of Italy, which was only 20 kilometres away by boat, he went to the mainland on business to Florence and took a little bit of time out, so it is said, to see his mistress. And this gave Napoleon long enough to get his act together and to instruct his people to be prepared to make a move to France. But what was Wellington doing during this period? Not many people know what Wellington was doing. After the Peninsular War, Wellington was potentially a bit of an embarrassment to the British government. He'd earned a tremendous reputation for himself. He'd earned riches as well. Parliament had voted him lots of money and so on. But what were they to do with him? He was still a relatively young man. And they came up with this great wheeze of offering him the role of being ambassador in Paris, a role which the alternative was to go and command the British forces in America. He wasn't very keen on that, and he thought, well, I'd better go to Paris. And actually, he was accompanied to Paris when he eventually went by his wife, who hadn't really accompanied him anywhere else. So on the 21st of April, Castlereagh, who was the Foreign Secretary in London, offered him the job, and Wellington accepted. But it was 4 months before he took up the appointment, partly because he was back in England, assuming some of the honours that he had been given, and also participating with all the monarchs of the other Allied countries that had succeeded in defeating Napoleon in April 1814. But again, not many people realise, I've already mentioned the unpopularity of the Bourbons, but not many people realise that that spread to Wellington himself. Wellington was not popular amongst the French population in Paris because he was closely identified with the Bourbons. And there were all sorts of threats of assassination of Wellington. And the British government got seriously concerned about what to do about him. And eventually they came up with a plan that he should go and relieve Castlereagh at the Congress of Vienna. This was quite a good plan because it took Wellington out of Paris, but Wellington took his time to go there, to go to Vienna, because he didn't want to be seen to be, if you like, fleeing from Paris under the pressure from or the possibility of assassination. But he did eventually depart for Vienna at the end of January with a couple of long-suffering ADCs, one of whom I seem to remember, Lennox, part of the Duke of Richmond's family, was only, I think, 14. That not a good he would have been, but the other ADC was a bit more senior and probably knew how to book a room in an inn. Anyway, Wellington eventually got to Vienna. And when he got there, as you can see from this picture, this picture was taken almost on the day, it wasn't not a picture, it was painted, almost on the day that he arrived. And it's interesting just to reflect on the left, numbered 1, is the Duke of Wellington himself. Number 2 is Prince Metternich, the Austrian foreign minister. Number 3 is Count Nisselrode, the Russian foreign minister. Number 4 is Castlereagh, who hadn't at that point left, but left soon afterwards to go back to England. Number 5 is the French foreign minister, Talleyrand, and number 6 is the Prussian chancellor, Prince Hardenberg. Also in Vienna at the time were representatives of some 200 states and delegations and goodness knows what. It was one hell of a jamboree, with Prince William III of Prussia present. And they'd all assembled in the late autumn, and by January they were doing quite a lot of business. Meanwhile, whilst they were meeting, Napoleon departed from Elba. He departed on the 26th of February. You can see there on the left-hand side of that painting the brig that he had. It was called Inconstant, and he was accompanied by that same militia of about 1,000, just over 1,000 people, and a small entourage of boats that he'd assembled, who took his army to the mainland. And it took him a while to get to from Elba to Gulf Juan, or the Gulf of Juan, where he arrived on the 1st of March. He managed to dodge quite a lot of ships that were on the lookout, not so much for him, but were patrolling the waters as standard practice. And if they obviously had seen the brig, they would have stopped it. Well, there was a certain amount of connivance because some people, some ships did see the brig but elected not to stop it. So he was able to land uncontested and subsequently chose the route which you can see on that map, which was actually, to begin with, was on back roads, because he wasn't at all sure how he was going to be treated during his journey to Paris. And he made good progress. The average march was 25 miles a day. On the 7th of March, or by the 7th of March, he'd reached Grenoble, and it was here, as I think some of you will know, that the Royalist Army, the 5th Line Regiment, came out to meet him, and their commanding officer went with the intention of halting Napoleon and arresting him. And Napoleon, unarmed, walked up to the troops and said, I'm here, I'm your emperor. Trust me, I've come to rejoin you. The commanding officer was of a view that actually this was not good news, and he ordered his men to fire on Napoleon. They declined to do that, they ignored him, and they transferred their allegiance there and then to Napoleon. And this picture is a reflection of that. Later in the day, Napoleon actually made it into Grenoble, where the rest of the garrison, including the 7th Line Regiment, transferred their allegiance. It was quite a large garrison, this one, in Grenoble, and it was the start of the subsequent rot. But whilst all this was going on, the message came through to the Congress of Vienna that Napoleon had escaped. And it was Talleyrand, the French foreign minister, who had the unenviable task of telling the Congress that Napoleon had escaped, and they greeted the news with peals of laughter, although subsequently the enormity of it began to sink in. This cartoon by John Lewis Marks is another very nice cartoon. Marx, incidentally, at the time he drew this, was only 19 years old. It shows Napoleon standing in the bows of a dinghy, shooting down the dove of peace. It shows the devil rowing the boat, while death holds the rudder. And the boat is crammed with Napoleon's soldiers, while others wait on the shore to greet him. And there are two fishermen standing on the shore as well, in the middle ground on the left, who are carrying off the very fat and very gouty Louis XVIII, who incidentally is shown wishing that he was back at Hartwell in Buckinghamshire, where he spent most of the French Revolutionary and Napoleonic Wars in exile. Now, continuing his march, Napoleon had a bit of a stay in Lyon. He stopped there for 4 days, and it was here that he started to issue all sorts of imperial decrees, cancelling many of those that had been issued by Louis XVIII in the 10 months or so that Louis XVIII had been on the throne. He rescinded the commissions and appointments that Louis had granted in his royalist army, and Napoleon formed his own provisional government while he was there. Now, many people talk about the 100 days, but nobody really knows when the 100 days begins and when it ends, and it's very difficult to make 100 days fit exactly the chronology of events. But many people start to count the 100 days from this period when he began to issue these imperial decrees. Meanwhile, on the 12th of March, while Napoleon was here, the Congress in Vienna received formal notification that Napoleon had escaped from Elba. Previously, Talleyrand had told them what he thought was the case, but it was on the 12th of March that they were formally told, and on the 13th, the Congress published a document declaring Napoleon an outlaw and empowering the military to arrest, summarily try, and execute him. Wellington signed this document reluctantly because every other country was signing it and they wanted him to sign it. Parliament later repudiated it. They didn't like this idea that Napoleon could be summarily executed almost on sight. Continuing the march, 17th was the day that Marshal Ney, who had promised Louis XVIII that he'd bring back Napoleon in a cage, actually met with Napoleon and transferred his allegiance. The first of the marshals to join Napoleon. On the 19th of March, with Napoleon getting closer to Paris, King Louis XVIII fled and established his court and his government at Gand in Belgium. And then the day afterwards, Napoleon arrived in Paris, and he was carried aloft into the Tuileries by a very enthusiastic, excited crowd. But Napoleon had all sorts of difficulties to face. Going back once again to the Congress of Vienna. On the 25th of March, the Congress signed what was known as a Treaty of Alliance. It was signed by all those that had signed the Treaty of Chaumont, which had followed the Treaty of Fontainebleau in 1814. It was signed by the British, the Prussians, the Russians, the Austrians, and the French, because remember, France was still ruled by a monarchy, and they were no keener on having Napoleon than anybody else was. It was also signed by 3 other countries who had been involved in the war: Spain, I think it was Denmark, and I think it was Switzerland. Now, it's important to realise, because this has an impact on what happened later at Waterloo. It's important to realise that Congress declared war not against France, who after all were signatories of the treaty, but they declared war against Napoleon. Each one of the allies, Austria, Prussia, Russia, and Britain, each said that they would produce an army of 150,000 to take on Napoleon. Britain, however, was not going to be able to provide an army of 150,000, whereas the others probably were able to produce men, but not money. So Britain became effectively the paymaster of this campaign, and within a very short space of time had put up £6 million, most of it, as I think some of you will know, found by the Rothschilds, the big bankers of the time. But what was the Allied war plan? What were they going to do with these 600,000 plus troops? The answer was they were going to converge on Paris, but it was going to take time. The Prussians and the British were relatively close to Paris and were able to act, or could act, relatively quickly. But that was not the case with the Russians and the Austrians. who had much further to come and also had to mobilize their forces. So it wasn't going to be immediate unless the armies acted individually. And if they acted individually, there was the prospect that they wouldn't have sufficient numbers to be certain of defeating Napoleon. But that was the plan. But what about Napoleon? What were his problems? Well, first of all, during this period before Waterloo, Napoleon had to re-establish his power in France. And that wasn't absolutely straightforward, because whilst those in Paris were for Napoleon, there was still a number of people on the periphery and in the provinces who supported the royalists. And the largest of these royalist uprisings took place in the Vendée, adjoining Brittany in the southwest of Paris. And Napoleon was forced to send 17,000 troops to quell an uprising of about 20,000 royalists. And these were troops who were not subsequently available to fight at Waterloo. Secondly, Napoleon didn't want to go to war in 1815. The Allies declared war on him. He didn't want to go to war. He wanted to actually have time to re-establish his power base, build up his army and the like. And so he sent a letter to each of the Allies saying, look, I don't want to go to war. I've no longer got any territorial ambitions on other countries, and trust me. But they didn't. They weren't going to. He'd reneged on his promises in the past, and they felt that he would do so in the future. The letter that was sent to London was returned unopened. Lord Castlereagh, the Foreign Secretary, directed the Prince Regent, who was the recipient of the letter, to send it back. And the general consensus among the Allies that it was better to have a feeble Louis XVIII than a rather strong, formidable Napoleon with republican ideas running France. Napoleon had to restore the public finances. That wasn't going to be easy. He only had 40 million in the treasury, 40 million francs, that is, and that wasn't very much. He managed to raise in fairly quick order another 80 million, which was just enough to meet all his urgent needs in the period before Waterloo. But although he had just enough to cope, the huge financial needs of France continued to haunt France long after Napoleon had departed for St. Helena. Napoleon had to raise and equip armies, which was not going to be easy, but actually he was singularly successful at achieving this. The Royalist army of 200,000, almost all of them transferred immediately to Napoleon. So he had 200,000 from the word go. And he recruited a number of others through mobilization, call-up, and he recovered a huge number of people who were either on leave or, more often than not, absent without leave. So by the time he'd finished, he had something not far short of 500,000 men. However, many of them were no more than National Guard, garrisoning cities and towns. And by the time he'd taken account of things like the Royalist Monday Rising and so on and so forth, he had a relatively small force available to him, more about which in a moment. But it was probably in the selection of his commanders that Napoleon got it wrong in this particular phase of the campaign. The former marshals and senior commanders, not all of them, were prepared to transfer their allegiance to Napoleon. And perhaps his greatest mistake was his choice of chief of staff. From 1805 through to 1814, Napoleon had an absolutely first-rate chief of staff called Berthier, Marshal Berthier. And Berthier declined to transfer his allegiance to Napoleon. He'd already transferred it once to the king. He wasn't going to do it again. And after Napoleon had reached Paris, he went with his wife to his wife's castle at Bamberg in East Germany. And whilst he was there, he very unfortunately fell out of a third window of the castle and died. Some people say it was suicide, but other people say actually no more than an accident. This all happened on the 1st of June. But by then, he'd already declared he wasn't prepared to be Napoleon's chief of staff during what was to be the coming campaign. As a result, Napoleon chose Marshal Soult. Marshal Soult was a very competent commander who proved himself as a competent commander in the Peninsular War and in other campaigns. But he was not a staff officer. He wasn't trained, and he was extremely inexperienced. And as you will probably see or know, Soult did not do a good job during the Waterloo campaign. And some of the deficiencies of the French army and its performance during this period can be laid firmly at the door of Soult. Now, by way of background, just one further point, because I'm giving you an overview, trying to tell you things that perhaps you don't know. And not too many people understand the history of what was known as the Austrian Netherlands and the Netherlands. And this slide gives you very briefly the information that you need to know, because when Waterloo was fought, Waterloo was by then, in 1815, or Belgium was, part of the United Netherlands, the Kingdom of the United Netherlands, under the hereditary rule of the House of Orange and Nassau. And it had two capitals, one in Brussels and one in Amsterdam. And as that slide shows you, if you work backwards, the problem all goes back to 1794, 1795, when France annexed Belgium in what should read 1793. Start again. Belgium became the Austrian Netherlands in 1714 and was annexed by the French in 1794. In 1795, they moved from Belgium, that is the Austrian Netherlands, into the Netherlands. And so they were occupying what by 1815 had become the United Netherlands, the Kingdom of the United Netherlands. And that is where Belgium, that is where Waterloo was. And the king was King William I. And he was 43 years old. He was quite an enlightened monarch. But he had a son, the Crown Prince of Orange, often referred to as Slender Billy or Sweet William by those who liked him, or Stinking Billy, or the Young Frog by those who didn't, because of his appearance was not dissimilar from a young frog. Now, his father absolutely insisted that if Wellington was to have command of an Anglo-Allied army in the Kingdom of the United Netherlands, then the Crown Prince was to retain command of the Dutch-Belgian troops that were in that army, and furthermore he was to have a prestigious Allied appointment as well. Now remember, the Crown Prince was in 1815 23 years old. Not a very experienced man to be given this extent of responsibility. And in fact, he had been commissioned into the British Army in 1811. He'd been given the rank of Lieutenant Colonel. He joined Wellington's staff and was there for a short while as an ADC. He wasn't there throughout the remainder of the Peninsular War, but he was there for some time. Wellington, with some reluctance, conceded. He realised he had to concede that the Crown Prince should have an Allied command as well as Dutch-Belgian command. And he was given command of Wellington's No. 1 Corps. General Rowland Hill commanded the 2nd Corps, and Wellington himself commanded the Reserve Corps. Now, this next slide shows the relative position of all the armies that were being assembled as a result of the Congress of Vienna's Treaty of Alliance. The blue, interestingly enough, the enemy were marked in blue in these times, and friendly forces were marked in red, an arrangement which was changed during the First World War. But Napoleon's free army, that is his manoeuvre army, he may have had 500,000 men, but he only had a manoeuvre army of 123,000. And that army of 123,000 was known as the Armée du Nord, the Grand Army of the North. And at this point, they were around the northern part of France. He had an army of 20,000 garrisoning Paris. He had, this slide shows 20,000 men in La Vendée. And he had a whole number of armies. There's one on this slide showing the Army of the Rhine, protecting the border with the Rhine, and there were a whole raft of other armies protecting his borders further south. Now, I said to you that the aim of the Allies was to converge on Paris. Wellington's army, at the start of the campaign, was 112,000. Blucher's army was 130,000. The armies which were forming much further away were much larger. The Russian army was going to be 200,000, and the Austrian army was destined to be 210,000. All in all, that adds up to, if you wanted to add it up, to 677,000 troops, converging eventually on Paris, but needing time to do so. And Napoleon was 123,000. So what were Napoleon's options? Well, he could wait to be attacked, or he could attack. Well, it was pretty obvious, really, that if he waited to be attacked, then eventually he was going to be seriously outnumbered. He might have, in total within France, up to 500,000, but he would still have to face 677,000 fighting men, and not all that 500,000 were fighting troops. In fact, as I've already indicated, probably only 250,000. So it didn't make sense for him to wait in Paris to be attacked. Clearly, it made sense for him to take the initiative and attack the Allied armies, but not all at the same time, ideally to attack them separately, one after the other, intending, of course, to defeat each one in turn. But to do this, he had to take the initiative. Ideally, he needed to make sure that he did, by manoeuvre, separate each army from the others. And there were attractions to Napoleon, to defeat Wellington's army first. Because if he could defeat Wellington's army and oblige Wellington to withdraw back through Ostend across the Channel to England, there was the possibility that Britain might lose interest in this campaign. And, as I've said to you already, the Allies were the paymasters. And if the Allies withdrew from the war and withdrew their money, the others would withdraw soon afterwards, because they wouldn't have the money to pay for their troops. So it wasn't an altogether a plan that was lacking a degree of cunning. There was also another objective. By attacking into Belgium, Napoleon hoped that the Belgians, after all, France had occupied them for 20 years and they were a French-speaking country, he hoped that the Belgians would very quickly transfer their allegiance to Napoleon. In fact, it's probably right to say that the Belgians were more inclined towards the French than they were towards the Allies. So if Napoleon was welcomed into Belgium and into Brussels, and he could defeat Wellington before he defeated any of the others, he was going to get off to a mighty good start. Now, in June 1815, this map shows the approximate dispositions of the Allied and Prussian armies. Wellington's army was to the southwest of Brussels, and Wellington was extremely concerned to maintain his lines of communication back to Ostend. Blucher was to the southeast of Brussels, and he was equally concerned to maintain his lines of communication back through Maastricht to Prussia. So you can see that Napoleon, if he was clever, might be able to force the two armies apart rather than bring them together. And if he forced the two armies apart, then they would absolutely want to maintain their lines of communication and be able to not have those lines cut. And Napoleon, I have to say, Wellington was almost paranoid about the fact that his lines of communication could be cut, and it led to delayed decision-making later. Now, there were four potential routes that Napoleon might use to get into Belgium. Bearing in mind where Paris is, these were the four most likely routes. The left hand, that is the western one, Wellington was particularly concerned about, because if that one were followed towards Gand and the royal family, then he would be cut off from his lines of communication. And although he would be forced towards Blucher, it wasn't something that had much appeal. If the French moved on the middle two lines, then clearly they would be heading towards Brussels, as they would be if they were on the most easterly route from Charleroi to Brussels. Now, each one of these routes was along established paved chaussee routes, along which administrative, traffic and artillery could be moved. It would be fair to say that although Wellington was concerned about his lines of communication, he wasn't oblivious to the fact that Napoleon might move up the main road from Charleroi to Brussels. He had discussed it with Blucher, and actually, although the Blucher's circle doesn't show it, Blucher did have outposts in the area of Charleroi. But you have to realise that if you were on the western extremity of Wellington's circle, it would take up to 2 days to get to the eastern extremity, the Brussels-Charleroi road, and much the same applied to Blucher as well. Now, as many of you know, Napoleon used the easterly route to make his approach, and it was almost inevitable and logical from his point of view that he should do so. But his attack was accompanied by a thoroughly competent deception plan, and he did achieve a considerable degree of operational surprise. Again, as many of you will probably know, when Wellington attended the Duchess of Richmond's ball on the evening of the 15th of June, nearly 24 hours, as it happens, after the French had crossed the border, he declared that he had actually been humbugged by the French, because all the intelligence reports had been subject to Napoleon's deception plan, and they had swallowed much of it, and Wellington was definitely of the opinion that Napoleon was going to approach up the route from Mons to Brussels, and many of his troops were deployed to counter that. And as I mentioned earlier, because the Allies had declared war on Napoleon and not declared war on France, the Allies were not able to advance into France to find out what Napoleon was doing. There were no outposts, there was no members of his army riding into France to find out where Napoleon was. He was entirely dependent, Wellington was entirely dependent on his intelligence staff, and they were entirely dependent on informers, many of whom were in the employ of Napoleon as part of his deception plan, and Wellington swallowed it. And it was some time before he was prepared to accept that he had misread the situation. Now, this is the last slide I'm going to show you before we have a break. And this summarizes events from the 15th to the 17th of June. And I said I wasn't going to give you a blow-by-blow account. And the reason is because I could give you a lecture on this, probably two, and I don't want to do that because I'm sure you want to press on to the second half of the talk. But what this shows you progressively is that on the 15th of June at 3 a.m. in the morning, the French crossed the French-Belgian border and through Charleroi. They didn't make as good progress as they intended. And their progress was slow because they had some pretty bum staff work, which resulted in their order of march, etc., being not very well organized, and all sorts of people bumping into other people, and delay arose. They were also held up remarkably successfully by the Prussian outposts around Charleroi. And as a result of that, it was past midday before the Prussians managed to get through and out of Charleroi, heading north. So by the time they did break out, half the day was gone. And then they advanced surprisingly cautiously. They didn't make a big dash. And gradually, during the course of that day and subsequently, they forfeited the operational surprise and the tactical surprise that they had by pursuing this particular route. As they moved northwards during the 15th of June, you can see the blue arrows reaching up to the village of Frasne, and you can see blue arrows pointing towards Ligny. But by the end of the 15th of June, although the French had made contact with some Dutch outposts and a Dutch battery near Quatre Bras, and had made contact with the Prussians southwest of Ligny, they hadn't really embarked in any major conflict. That was all to change on the following day, when the two battles of Quatre Bras and the Battle of Ligny were both fought on that day. Napoleon decided, actually, that he would put his main effort towards defeating not Wellington, because he wasn't sure where Wellington's army was at that point, but he had a pretty good idea where Blucher and Blucher's army were, and they were grouped around Ligny. So he decided to put his main effort in on Ligny, and he made as to make battle with the Prussians, and in the second part of the day, a very fierce battle was fought with the Prussians at Ligny. Meanwhile, his left wing, the weaker wing under Marshal Ney, advanced towards Quatre Bras, but again very cautiously. In fact, they didn't get on the move much before 11 o'clock in the morning because they were plundering their breakfast. By the time they approached Quatre Bras, Wellington, who had given orders during the night, parts of his allied army were converging on Quatre Bras from the direction of Nivelles and from the direction of Brussels. A Dutch division arrived at Quatre Bras, the first to arrive, and fought with great heroism to hold up the French. And then during the afternoon, Picton's 5th Division arrived with the 1st 95th Rifles, and Wellington was literally throwing troops into the Battle of Quatre Bras piecemeal as they arrived to stop the French from cutting the road from Braine-le-Comte to Nivelles to Quatre Bras to Sombref to Ligny. It was imperative that he kept that road open, because that was his lateral lines of communication and reinforcement between himself and Blucher. And he had promised Blucher that he would send troops to help him if he was able, and Blucher likewise. But during the 16th of June, both were so caught up in their own battles that neither of them were able to do it. And Napoleon was not without his own problems, because he had an army marching, not an army, a corps, d'Erlon's corps, marching needlessly due to poor staff work between Quatre Bras and Ligny, and failed to take part in any part of the battle. An army of about 17,000 men, who could, if they'd been available either at Quatre Bras or Ligny, have tipped the balance in Napoleon's favour, that they won. So where were we at the end of the 16th of June? Wellington had held off the French at Quatre Bras. His army was being reinforced throughout the night of the 16th, 17th, and gradually he established predominance at Quatre Bras. The Prussians by late evening had been defeated by the French, but not crushed. They withdrew as best they could towards Wavre, to the east of Mont Saint-Jean and Waterloo. The French failed to follow them up, and actually that element of the French army that was responsible for following them up didn't realise they'd gone north. They thought he'd gone northwest, back on his lines of communication to Maastricht, and followed shadows, mainly deserting Prussians, towards Maastricht. So that wasn't hugely successful. Well, on the 17th of June, we're on to Saturday, the 17th of June, Wellington ordered the withdrawal of his army back through Genappe to Mont Saint-Jean. And that withdrawal took place largely out of contact. There was a bit of fighting around Genappe, but the French were very dilatory about following up Wellington's army, and he was able to get most of it back to Mont Saint-Jean by the evening of the 17th of June. And the French, meanwhile, were withdrawing relatively unharassed to Wavre. So by the night of the 17th of June, most of Wellington's army was grouped around that dotted oblong of Mont Saint-Jean, and most of the Prussian force was moving and closing in on Wavre. And at that particular point, I'm going to break. I'm not going to offer you the opportunity to ask questions at this stage, although if you want to ask me any during the break, please do. Now, Christine, have we a problem?
We do have a slight problem, yes. The caterer has not shown up. But
right.
We can offer wine.
Right. We will offer you wine. We're not quite sure what's happened to the caterer. It might be a traffic accident, it might be the M27 where he comes from. We don't know. Why don't you go now out of here, have a look round the exhibition, but pick up a glass of wine as you do so. And when we're ready to come back, there will be a loud shout, return to your seats, please. Can't get the heating right, can we? We will.
Well done, Chris. That's terrific.